So if we move beyond teenagers to just adults, what are some big takeaways, we can make about modern intimacy, sexual behavior among adults? Well, the kind of big takeaway is that sexual behavior is less constrained now than it has been in the past. And there are kind of three primary reasons for this. One of which is the advances in birth control. So sexual activity has been freed from being primarily connected to reproduction. There has been a greater acceptance of sex outside of marriage, and the number of social sanctions imposed on those people who engage in extramarital sex. We'll talk about the fact that the sexual double standard does still exist, but this is nothing like what it was in the past. And then, of course, the growing independence of young adults from parents has weakened the ties of parental supervision. Young people are now spending a prolonged period of time outside of their parents' homes without being married, right? They go away to college, they live in dorms, they live in their own apartments, they graduate from college and they, get jobs, all without getting married. If they don't go to college, they graduate, from high school and get a job and once again are, more likely to move out of their parents' home and live on their own. And so all of this means that, sexual behavior is now seen as being more personal and intimate, and not merely a social requirement of reproduction. But just because it is more personal and intimate does not mean that we can't still talk about it from a sociological stance, because it is still being, these decisions, these norms are still being shaped by larger social forces. So one of those larger social forces, that was responsible for freeing up sexual norms and sexual behaviors, is, as they said, reproductive technology. And one of the early advances that really changed this was the pill. And it's still today the predominant form of birth control in the United States. And although there are positives and negative implications associated with this development, it was significant because it allowed women greater control over their own reproduction, and it could be done relatively privately. And it kind of shifted the responsibility from a man, where if you're talking about heterosexual sex, from a man, having to have a condom, to, women now being responsible, for their reproductive, protection. It's also a more effective contraception than methods women had been using or avoiding using previously. So whether it was a condom or a diaphragm, the rhythm method, certainly the birth control is more effective at stopping pregnancy. Now the problem is it doesn't stop the spread of AIDS. And there is certainly has been some research that suggests that, during the 80s, when the HIV/AIDS epidemic spread to heterosexual women, one underlying factor behind that quick spread was the fact that so many women were not having sex with condoms because they had grown reliant on using the pill. And of course, just, from a kind of health standpoint, it is a hormonal birth control method. And there is a very established historical research showing that, when the pill was put on the market, it was kind of rushed to market. It did not necessarily, it was not necessarily rigorously tested, especially long-term tested. And we now know that there are health implications, especially for women that stay on the pill for a prolonged period of time. And that's because, at least originally, that was never the expectation, that a woman can be on the pill for 25, 30 years, right? Because the idea was, of course, that she would at some point settle down, get a man, have babies, multiple babies, and therefore would not be reliant on the pill. But, the pill did kind of free up, as was noted, it freed up that link between, you have sex and you're going to be risking getting pregnant. So you need to make decisions around who you have sex with and how often you're having sex with that in mind. So once you didn't really have to think about that, unsurprisingly, we started to see some shifts in some of that other sexual behavior, including sexual behavior that had been labeled traditionally as being deviant. And so, just kind of based on our research in sexuality in America, some important takeaways. Forget what those people say about premarital sex being morally wrong, because it seems like most Americans are having it. 95% of Americans have sexual intercourse before marriage, and although a lot of that sexual activity does take place between people who are in long-term relationships, and oftentimes there's even an expectation of fidelity and monogamy, if not eventual marriage, it's still just worth noting, people are not, by and large, waiting to have sex until after they say I do. There does seem to be this gendered aspect where men have more partners than women, although they're not having sex significantly earlier than women. The average age of first intercourse is 17 years for both. But by the time men are in their late 30s, on average, they've had 7 sexual partners, while women have had 4. And certainly some of that gap probably is explained by the sexual double standard and the stigma that women face for, engaging in free, non-constrained sexual experiences. They certainly face more stigma than men do. But, even just 7 and 4, those aren't ridiculously high numbers. So, maybe just kind of showing that, promiscuous sex, the idea that, having sex with too many partners, that at least in America, that's still largely kind of internalized as being a bad thing. And most people therefore don't engage in sexual intercourse with a whole lot of partners. And that's what your book notes. That's also what your research notes, right? That only 10% of men and 7% of women have 3 or more partners in a given year. So, for the most part, people aren't just kind of, sexing their way through the city. A lot of that sex is happening in committed, monogamous relationships. And then one thing that we'll talk about towards the end of this lecture, and it's come up in previous lectures, is sex without consent is relatively common. And so we'll talk about that more when we get to our section on rape culture. So, where does this sexual gender gap come from? This gap around, number of partners that men and women have over their lifetime. And, that gap is diminished in the last, 3 to 4 decades, but it hasn't completely gone away. What can help us understand that? We're going to talk about some concepts here. We're going to talk about sexual socialization, sexual agency, and sex education. So, where did you learn about sex? Because that's what it means when we say sexual socialization, right? It's the idea that you had to learn, that you had to be taught about sex. You had to learn kind of what are the sexual norms and mores, values in your given society. And, you probably learned, you probably got different messages from different socializing agents. And, we've gone over socialization in a previous chapter, but yes, once again, socializing agents could be, your parents, your peers, siblings. It could be your church. It could be the media, particularly pop culture, magazines, movies, television, internet. It could be your school, particularly through the form of sex education. So you can imagine that some of these socializing agents are probably going to be better or worse than others at presenting you with accurate, inclusive, non-judgmental, non-biased information. And some of these agents are going to be worse at doing that. So, we enter adulthood as individuals with like this mixed bag. Some of us maybe, received really good sexual socialization, and got really positive messages and healthy messages about sex, and some of us perhaps did not. Now, you think the great equalizer there would be the sex education, but in our country, because this has been such a controversial topic, that's just not the case. So there are kind of 2 primary forms or, broad categories that sex education can take in this country. You could have comprehensive sexuality education or abstinence only. And so it's, worth noting that during during the 90s, after teen pregnancy had been declared a national crisis. And then after Clinton, we had, Bush come into office and, really kind of hitting hard, you know, uh, Republican talking points around family values and morality. There was this push in the federal government to promote abstinence only education, which is more or less what it sounds. For the most part, they only really provide information about abstinence. They don't spend a lot of detail or provide a lot of clear cut hands-on education around contraceptives, around different forms of sexuality, homosexual, bisexual orientations. Don't really provide a lot of information on masturbation. It's a big focus on, the message is you wait. And the federal government so wanted states, schools to promote that message that they attached a lot of money to these abstinence only programs, and they were willing to give schools additional money if they adopted these abstinence only programs. And you can see that the states who took the money, those were the states where that you can see in gray. They're this, in the states in pink are the ones who declined it. But what we've discovered is, not providing young people with the information they need to make important choices about their sexuality and sexual protection, reproductive health, it actually proved to be counterintuitive, because they still had sex, but now they did not know how to protect themselves, or, there was a lot of shame around their decision. And so they didn't protect themselves. So the states, at least some of the states that pushed abstinence only, a lot of those states had some of the highest teenage birth rates. And that's what that map below that abstinence only funding is showing. You can see that, like, some of the states that had some of the highest, places like Oklahoma and Texas and Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, really almost the only outliers where you had states that, didn't take the abstinence only funding money, but still had, relatively high teenage pregnancy rates were, those southwestern states of New Mexico and Arizona. Otherwise, you see that huge cluster in the South, and that was also the part of the country that most embraced abstinence only funding. Now, since the Bush administration, now in the United States, what we have is a mixed bag, because it's largely decided on the state level. The federal government during the Obama years, they did not really push for, and incentivize a specific type of sex education. And so what you see is, some states require it and it must be comprehensive, and some states don't require it. And some states require it, but it has to focus on abstinence. So that's why I said, when you're thinking about the fact, that schools are supposed to be maybe the equalizer of knowledge around sexuality, because we can't really control the messages that people get from their parents or their friends or their peers or even their church. Unfortunately, in America, that's also not the case. Schools aren't giving the same messages around sexuality. And so that means that people are kind of picking up their messages about sex from different people. And those messages, one way to kind of think about them and describe them is to use the term sexual script. Sexual scripts basically tell us who we should desire, what we should do, how we should act. It is like, if you think about, what a script is, if you've ever been in a play, it provides you, your line, it tells you how you should behave as a character. That's more or less what sexual scripts are. And a good example, and obviously they're socially constructed, so they're going to vary over time and over space between different cultures. but they are promoted and advanced in society through a variety of those socializing agents. And so we learn our sexual scripts from a variety of sources, and then we kind of internalize them. And so a good example of how it gets internalized, and then how a sexual script can kind of become persistent, like it can persist over time, is like the basis analogy. Don't know who actually created it first. And of course, depending on where you live and, how old you are, there might be some disagreement, around what each base symbolizes, but this idea that, we expect, sexual activity to kind of progress in this fashion, to intensify in this fashion. That expectation is a sexual script. And what we are expecting at each base is a sexual script. And so sexual scripts, in addition to varying over time and between cultures, they also can vary between populations within a culture, particularly populations related to sexual orientation, because we have different expectations. We sometimes have different rules for men and women, for heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual men and women, in our society. And but just because sexual scripts persist does not mean they also can't be changed, because we also can think of the distinction between traditional sexual scripts versus contemporary ones, right? And we've talked about in other chapters, dating scripts. So it's very similar, except now we're just talking about just solely on like a sexual basis. Your sexual scripts can interact and do interact with other hierarchical categories like age and class and race. So it's not just gender that matters here, like our discussion of intersectionality has emphasized in various ways. Other social identities also can come into play. And this can be particularly true when considering, the fact that sexual, preference, sexual attraction in this country is racialized. And so your book has a long discussion of this. The idea that, if you think about the erotic marketplace, right? So basically, like it's like the job market, except for sexual partners. In the same way that you can be a strong or weak job candidate, you can be a strong or weak candidate in the erotic marketplace. And what makes you strong and weak is at least maybe partially related to, how closely you align or embody what's been deemed sexually attractive and or beautiful, and that of course is racialized. We discussed this when we talked about gendered strategies, right? That Black men are hyper masculinized, but Black women are also seen as being masculine, compared to Asian women who are hyper feminized, but then Asian men are, more likely to be emasculated. And so what this might mean is that people have these stereotypes, and this has kind of shaped their sexual preferences. And so what we have in this country is a hierarchy of sexual desirability. And of course, this isn't like on an individual basis, right? Because it's not saying that, there would not be, some Black woman that, that would be more sexually desirable than some, random white woman, right? We're not talking about on an individual basis here. We're talking about on a group level. So if we're ranking people by entire groups, oftentimes, even though people, at this point in our society, it's not the type of thing that is acceptable to say. but it's often the type of thing that people do feel and they uphold in their dating preferences, that, some groups of people are more desirable than others. And, and we can see this, and this was something that maybe that was just whispered or talked about, back when people were dating, meeting people out at clubs or restaurants, or, their church or their schools, right? This sense of like, oh, I'm a Black woman and it seems like nobody here is interested in meeting me, or, oh, I'm an Asian man and it seems like nobody here wants to give me their phone number. But, the rise of online dating, first through websites, and now, of course, through apps, it means that we now actually have data. We have the numbers, and we can look at these trends and see to what extent is this true. And so, we can look at OkCupid in particular has been very transparent about providing their data, so that researchers can kind of understand, how this plays out. And so, whether they are talking about how they rate people, or, who's more or less likely to get replies. I give you a video that pretty much goes over a lot of this data and some of the takeaway trends, but you can just kind of see that, oftentimes there are races of men and women who are seen, particularly by people outside of their group, as being less desirable. And this is not the only form of what the authors call eroticized inequality. There is inequalities in regards to appearance. Men need to be bigger, they need to be stronger, they need to be taller. And so if you're a man who's not who's not those things, you have a liability in the erotic marketplace. There's age. There's less stigma of an older man dating a younger woman. I talked about that with the May-December relationships. That's such a awfully nice way to put it. But when an older woman dates a younger man, there's this stigma, this assumption she's being used. The term cougar. There is no kind of term for men who are older who date younger women. We haven't turned them into an animal term. We don't call them, I don't know, tortoises or something, but, we have that term for women. SES, your book talks about how, the significance of dating down for men versus women is different. And that's because for men, it's almost, expected, and in some cases even seen as desirable, that your female partner not be as educated or not have as high of an income. While for women, the expectation is that, if you're not going to date your equal, that you are going to, attempt to marry up. And your book talks about how the MBA expected salary experiment kind of showed that women were aware that men maybe would be less interested in them, or they perceived that men would be less interested in them if they made a lot of money. So when they knew that their expectations, their salary expectations were going to be public, then they gave lower salaries than when it was private. Like a lot of research, we don't have as much research. We don't have as much established research in our LGBTQ relationships. But your textbook does talk about that, in these relationships, women oftentimes have a slight preference for feminine women, and among men who are interested in men, there's a larger preference for straight acting men. And they talk about this concept of what they call masking, which is kind of combining the word mask with masculine. But, this idea that they're looking for, a gay male partner, but one who presents himself in this kind of hegemonic masculine light. So, all of these just means that, some of us go into the erotic marketplace let alone the dating market, where you would imagine, the hurdles become even higher when people are thinking about, who they want to seriously date, and, maybe marry. But even just in the, sexual market, the erotic marketplace, we go into this marketplace and we have a different kind of advantages, and some of us have different disadvantages. And, research shows that not all of that is just individuated. Some of that's related to larger demographic characteristics. But going back to this kind of concept of a sexual script, let's talk about one that's, we've discussed previously, which is the sexual double standard. So first of all, let's just acknowledge that there's this gender binary when it comes to love and sex. Women are supposed to be interested in love, the relational imperative. They're supposed to want and seek out relationships. They're supposed to want to get married. And then men, of course, are not supposed to be interested in relationships. They're supposed to be interested in sex. And so, just kind of that belief, helps support this sexual double standard, where what happens is, we apply stricter moral or legal controls, even if you're thinking about it historically, to women's sexual behavior versus men. And, a good way to kind of remember it is like slut versus stud, right? We're very quick to label, women sluts if they have sex too quickly, if they have too many sexual partners, if they, if they enjoy sex too much even. But a lot of that same behavior, if it's displayed by a man, there isn't a negative stigma, there isn't a negative label. Instead, there's the much more positive connotation of him being a stud. And so, historically, the sexual double standard has resulted in, some informal codes of behavior for women. They must not initiate sex. Instead, they have to do this whole song and dance. Your book describes it as the push and resist dynamic. This idea that men are supposed to push and women are supposed to resist to show they're not that kind of girl, but then eventually they give in. And of course, just thinking about this, from a rape culture standpoint, as we're going to talk about later, this is really problematic. Women are supposed to be passive sexually. We'll talk about that, the difference between being, having sexual subjectivity versus objectivity. Women should not have multiple sex partners. You can think about that in terms of they shouldn't have multiple sex partners at one time in their life, meaning, they shouldn't be sleeping with 2 or 3 guys. But then they also just shouldn't have, too many sexual partners in their past. That goes along with the idea that, women aren't expected and they're punished for being promiscuous, but men get a lot more leeway around promiscuity. Women should only have sex within the confines of marriage. This goes back to that Madonna whore dichotomy, right? You're either a good girl who is, let me make sure that my computer doesn't restart. You're either a good girl who, does not, have sex outside of marriage, and therefore is deserving of being wifed, of being seen in that light, or you're a bad girl, you're a whore, in which case, no one is expected to want to, think of you or treat you in that way, in that respectable fashion. And dichotomy means that we kind of place women in this position where they're seen as either or, and they're kind of locked into these positions in terms of how people perceive them. And then, sex does not need to be enjoyable for women. That relates back to that whole sexual objectivity versus subjectivity. That kind of informal, sexual norm, sexual script certainly plays into the orgasm gap, which we will talk about in upcoming slides. And, it's just worth noting that, the double standard has become less prevalent, but is still a prevailing sentiment in many areas and within many communities. And even in areas and communities where it's not a prevailing sentiment, it still persists, even in a diminished fashion. It has not been like stamped out by any means. And it can pop up in the weirdest places. So, there used to be, I don't know if you remember when that Drake song Hotline Bling was super popular. And you probably were just two-stepping and not listening to the lyrics. But if you actually listen to the lyrics, read the lyrics, there is a lot of kind of judging his ex for this behavior. And it's a clear double standard. The fact that, she's wrong for being out and partying with her girlfriends, being dressed in a sexy fashion for having fun, but the presumption is that, he isn't supposed to be held to that same moral code. And so that just kind of shows you how, the sexual double standard, it's not so much that it's acceptable for people to like say, oh, he's a stud, but you're a slut. But there are much more subtle ways in which we still uphold that sexual script, even in contemporary society. So now let's talk about kind of one of those other kind of sexual scripts that was related to the sexual double standard, which was that idea that women were supposed to be passive sexually. So there is this link, once again, this kind of gender binary about, how men and women are perceived to experience sexuality. Men are seen as being sexual subjects. They have agency. They are the aggressor. They're supposed to take charge. When it's that push and resist, they are the ones pushing. And your textbook describes that as sexual subjectification. They are the sexual subject. And oftentimes, especially, and this is more true with some partners than others, but, the sexual act ends with the man's climax because he is the subject. He is the hero of that sexual encounter. If the woman has not climaxed, in some cases, for some men, it's just kind of, oh, well. But maybe even more importantly is the fact that if the woman climaxes before the man, the expectation isn't that, that she has the right or the ability to then shut that interaction down, because as the sexual subject, his climax is supposed to matter. His is supposed to count. And that's because, societally, we oftentimes think of women as being sexual objects or sexual objectification. Their bodies are acted upon. They do not have sexuality. They are sexuality, right? It's not about their sex, the sexual act for them, but the fact that they are supposed to be sexy. They are supposed to be stimulating and whatever to the male. And there's this concept for that, the heterosexual male gaze, right? That it's less about what it feels like and more about what it looks like to him, right? If you think about some of those poses, if you've ever partaked in any type of pornographic material, there's no way that most of those poses are comfortable, particularly for women. And if they're not comfortable, then they probably are not enjoyable, unless you're a gymnast whose body really does just easily bend and contort in those ways. But it's that idea, that arch back and that tilted neck, right? That it makes your body look good to your partner, and he therefore finds that sexy. It doesn't matter if you don't find it sexy, if it's not helping you experience pleasure. Like, that's not the concern when you're the sexual object. And so that's that distinction that, the authors talk about, that distinction between being sexy versus being sexual. Being sexy is about that sexual objectification, that heterosexual male gaze. It's about how you appear and look and how your body is eliciting a response in him. While being sexual, of course, is about your own enjoyment, your own pleasure, not necessarily worrying about what you look like or sound like or what have you. But we know that, this sexual script, which is promoted by movies, commercials, pornography, which I already just mentioned, we know that, this thing gets internalized into the heads of women, and they even self-objectify, right? They focus more on being that object and less on being that subject, right? It becomes less about, I want to have this enjoyable sexual experience and I want to feel this way, I want to orgasm. And instead it's more about, I want to look this way, and I want him to think that I am sexy. So much so that even in the midst of having the act, Wade describes how women can engage in what she calls spectating, where they really are so worried about what they look like during the act. Like, is my stomach jiggling? Can he see my cellulite? Is this making my stomach bunch up in rolls? They're so worried about how they look through the eyes of their usually male partner that they are not, in fact, enjoying the act. They're so worried about being good at being sexy that they're being horrible at being sexual. And so, unsurprisingly, what this results in is an orgasm gap.